that they come to your countries with a lesser breed of values?
No, I don't think I said that at any point, and that's another time you've tried to put something in my mouth.
Douglas Murray lands in Doha to argue the unpopular side. The moderator calls his view Western-centric within 90 seconds. He answers with the Ottoman Empire. He answers with Gallup's polling on sub-Saharan Africa. He answers with Moynihan's law. Then a distress call from a sinking boat plays to the room, and when the moderator puts words in his mouth, he shuts it down in one sentence. Watch a hostile room fail to land a single punch. Let's get into it.
I've been traveling across several continents in recent years, not just to the countries that people are fleeing from around the world, but also to the places they're fleeing to the refugee camps, migrant camps that people end up in. And I've been struck by so many thoughts during this time, but one of them is that there are so many utopian dreams that occur. People dream that you could live in a borderless world on one hand. Other people pretend you could just stop anyone coming. These are impossible dreams, but somewhere in the middle of them is something we need to aim for. And one of the ways I've started to realize that we need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad. I'm a good person, you're a Nazi. It's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues. There are two virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering. And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that. But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. And we can't ignore those two parts. We need to recognize that's what's going on here. This is why it's so difficult, and the debate goes down the middle of all of us.
Murray kills both fantasies in 90 seconds. Nobody gets a borderless world. Nobody gets a sealed country. Then he sets the real terms: mercy for the people in the camps, justice for the people in the receiving towns. He puts both on the table before anyone can shout. That is why the moderator has to interrupt him later.
So look, there are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this. And I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue. But why we need to think about this. Let me give you just 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to. Secondly, what are the differences between people fleeing for their lives from a war zone and people fleeing serious, severe economic deprivation in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa? Now, there are differences, but if you recognize that, then you've got to work out where along the way you would put your line for legitimate asylum claims. A third of people in sub-Saharan Africa polled last year by Gallup said they wanted to move and leave sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got to work out along this way, if you're going to have a sustainable asylum policy, who qualifies for it. And I would suggest we're not very good at having that discussion either. A third point. We know that some cultures find it easier to mix into other cultures than others, but we don't know exactly how. And we don't know what the proportions of people are in another culture that work well, integrate well, adapt well, and what the proportions are that start to make that integration, that adaptation far harder. We have thought very little about this, and what thinking there has been pretty bad. Let me give you another example of something we need to think about. How do we deal with a question this serious in the age of social media? An age when a single photograph of a single person can go all around the world, and everybody sees it, and everybody says something must be done. And their politicians think, I've got to do something. And then they do something, and the public say, no, that wasn't the something we were thinking of. We've thought of something else, but we don't know what. How do we live in that world? How do politicians act in that world? How do we have any form of political leadership in that world? How do we work out what the right thing to do is in that world? Not just in the short term, but in the long term too.
Count the questions nobody else on this stage will ask. Who can come and who cannot? Where is the line between a war refugee and an economic migrant? A third of sub-Saharan Africa told Gallup they want to leave. That is a policy problem, not a slur. And the social media point is the sharpest one. One photograph goes around the world overnight, then politicians do something they never thought through.
How do we ensure that we're able to have a serious and deep debate about these issues, and that we're able to allow people to express legitimate concerns and have that debate without those legitimate concerns being dismissed as xenophobic, nativist, and so on? How do we work out where that might be the case, and how do we work out where it's not, where there are legitimate fears? Sixth question, how do we overcome fatalism? The fatalism you hear everywhere these days, sometimes in the spirit of optimism. This is the world as it is now. People move. This is globalization. Get used to it. Suck it up. Don't complain. How do we get used to that? How do we deal with that? Now, I've got, rather unsurprisingly, fewer answers than I've got questions. But let me give you just 3 answers I would suggest that we could hold on to as the beginning of a set of answers to this. The first is, hold a very clear line between people fleeing for their lives from war zones and people fleeing economic deprivation. Find and hold to a very clear line on it. If you do not, I predict with absolute certainty that you will continue to erode public sympathy with people who need the sympathy the most, because these things will be rubbed together and elided. So I would suggest, first of all, find that and hold on to it pretty close.
He asks how you raise concerns without being called xenophobic. Then he asks how you beat the fatalism. This is globalization, suck it up, stop complaining. Murray calls that a failure of political leadership, and he admits he has fewer answers than questions. Watch how rare that is on a panel. His first answer is a hard line. War refugees on one side, economic migrants on the other.
Close. Second thing I would suggest, find a broad level of agreement, and there is a lot of this internationally now, that the best way to cope with the most serious situations is to keep people roughly in the area of the country for which they fled. It's much easier to look after them there. It's much easier to get international aid there. My own country, Great Britain, is, I think, the second largest donor of international aid within the regions of Syria. That should, I think, be one of the models for this, that we make sure that we don't have this idea that some people have that you disperse X percentage there and X percentage there and put these people there. Thirdly, I would say make sure you increase economic productivity in refugee camps. Make sure people have a hope and a purpose and a work life when they're outside of their country. Look, I'm concluding with this because otherwise the music will get so loud you won't hear me. There are no simple answers to this, because there are no simple questions in this. This whole business does not give itself to sound bites, but it does need a much deeper debate than most of us have been willing to have so far. Thank you.
Britain is the second largest aid donor inside the Syrian region. That fact never survives the retelling of this debate. His fix is unglamorous and specific. Keep people near home so they can actually go home. Put work and purpose inside the camps. No slogans, no dispersal quotas, no magic percentages. Then the moderator gets the microphone. Watch how fast this stops being polite.
All right. Douglas Murray, thank you very much. A few provocative thoughts, no doubt, that you mentioned there. A few jumped at me, such as when you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. You seem to conveniently forget that the developed world moved to the developing world without asking permission.
No, I don't.
It seems to me as well that this is a particularly Western-centric viewpoint, and a misleading one at that, because you know as well as I do, and the figures show it, 85% of the world's refugees, in fact, settle in neighboring countries in the Middle East,
Sure.
in Africa and Asia. They do not rush over to Europe.
Sure. You'd make a big mistake if you think I hadn't heard of colonialism.
You don't think to address it in any
And I'd
way.
also suggest, by the way, that I don't know how long we're going to go on about colonialism for. I'm happy to do it as long as you like. But let
don't
me
we
just
have to be factful, though?
Well,
Don't we have to be
But also, don't think,
careful about
don't think,
facts,
if I
about
may say so,
history?
that colonialism was just a Western thing. What was one of the largest and most significant empires in history but the Ottoman Empire?
We're
Do we
talking
say
about-
that Turkey has to do something like the West to deal with
That's
this?
not the issue. You
brought up colonialism.
You are talking about the Western view that they should stay.
There it is, 40 seconds in. The moderator's opening move is colonialism. Murray does not flinch or apologize. He has heard of colonialism. Thanks. Then he names the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest empires in human history. Does Turkey owe anything under this rule? The moderator's answer is to change the subject.
It seems to me to be much wiser that if you have a very large humanitarian crisis in, for instance, Syria, you try to make sure that people remain in the area. This doesn't say all of them, but it is more likely. I absolutely agree they do. I've seen it firsthand.
Look at Turkey, 3.5 million refugees. Look at Lebanon and Jordan per capita.
What
the
I'm
countries that have
suggesting
the
to
most.
you
In
is,
fact, in Lebanon, you've got 1 in every 4 person living in that country is a Syrian refugee.
Absolutely.
So to suggest they're not doing very much is just being misleading, being dishonest.
Believe me, I'm not being misleading. And I said from the outset that I agree with the point that most refugees remain in the area. And I said that I think that that's a good idea.
Count the interruptions in that stretch. Murray agrees with the Lebanon and Jordan numbers immediately. 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. Jordan carries the same weight per capita. He has been there and seen it. So the accusation of being misleading collapses instantly. You cannot call a man dishonest for agreeing with you. The audience applauds him anyway.
I'm suggesting to you that I think it's better that people, for instance, fleeing Syria, end up in the countries around Syria in order to be able to return to their country than putting them in
but
Norway.
But they will return. You are suggesting that they don't want to return. Who in their right mind, if they had the option,
when did I say that?
We'll hear from a refugee, if they had the option to return, of course they'd want to return.
I didn't say they wouldn't.
They leave everything behind. But you seem to also be oblivious to another important fact that I just want to throw at you before we go to a video clip that I want to show you. It's what about the moral responsibility, though, of Western countries that have contributed to the destabilization of the region, the meddling, the military interventions, not to mention the arms sales that continue as we speak? What about that?
Do you want me to answer that? Okay, I'll answer that one frankly. Nobody denies, for instance, the disaster of Iraq. But who are the people who intervened most in Syria?
Isn't just Iraq.
Hang on. Let me answer it. Who intervened most in Syria? It wasn't America. It wasn't Britain. It's Iran, Russia. It's, among others, countries, including the one we're in and others around the Gulf here.
Before we got to Syria, we had Iraq, we had Libya, we had many
countries in this neck of the woods were much more involved in the Syrian civil war than my country was.
Well, you're also
so do you want to take some responsibility for that? Do you want to take more refugees here in Qatar? Do you want to take more in the Gulf?
No one is immune to any sort of criticism. But we're talking about the Western countries, the British countries, the British countries.
What did Britain do in Syria?
We're talking about these governments that you seem to suggest should be immune.
No, when did I suggest that?
Absolved of any responsibility.
When did I suggest?
She says he claims refugees don't want to go home. He never said it, and he says so. When did I say that? Then comes the arms sales question. Murray concedes Iraq was a disaster in one sentence. Then he asks who really intervened in Syria, Iran, Russia, and the Gulf states, including this one. He asks Qatar to take more refugees on Qatari soil. That is the bravest sentence in the debate.
I want to get to the other point that you make, and it's an important one, Douglas Murray. You suggest that we need to actually balance between two very important virtues, two important concepts of mercy toward the refugee and justice toward your own citizens. Let's take a quick look at this instance involving refugees.
Do you send anyone for us? We are the Syrians, about 300.
Sir, I give you the number of Malta authority because you are near Malta.
Hello?
Yes.
About 100 children and 100 women and maybe 100 men. Please hurry. Water is coming into it. The boat is going down. We are dying. 300
Yes,
persons.
You have called Malta. You have called Malta.
Don't throw us. Captain, run away.
Call Malta. Call Malta.
I have no enough account on the mobile. It will cut. Please. You have my number now. You call me, please.
That recording is the hardest moment in the room. 300 people, a sinking boat, and a phone call. The man on the line keeps repeating Malta. The boat capsized 5 hours later. The moderator uses it to ask about mercy. Murray does not dodge the clip. He says responsibility belongs to everyone in that room too. Watch what he says about the 1951 Refugee Convention.
A very chilling video, though I don't suggest that you respond on behalf of the Coast Guard, the Italian Coast Guard. But again, it's that same issue of shifting the problem to others. And just for a little bit of context, in fact, this boat, which capsized 5 hours after this call, killing quite a few people on board, we heard that there were about 100 women, 100 children on board, that was twice as close to an Italian island as it was to Malta. But again, this idea that, we have to safeguard our values, where does mercy fit in that? Not just mercy, but the obligation, the legal obligations of states to refugees.
I'd suggest that we all make sure we don't shift responsibility. There is a responsibility to everyone. That would include state we're standing in now, wouldn't it? It would include all the states in this region. It would include the brother states. It would include the UMA. It would include everybody. It wouldn't just be the Italians. Now, the Italians, by the way, and let me just finish this point.
That's a valid issue, but let me respond to it, because you mentioned the states of the region. It's a valid issue, but unlike the European countries, allow me to just make this point, unlike the European countries,
I'll respond to 2 points.
They are not parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So the legal obligations are, well, it's just a fact.
Conveniently, isn't it?
But I'll let you carry on.
But this means that countries that are signatories to the Refugee Convention get more blame and more assumption that they are going to have to hold more of the burden than countries that didn't. And I'm suggesting to you that nobody should be able to absolve themselves from blame.
There is the point she calls convenient. It is not convenient. It is a fact. Italy signed the 1951 Refugee Convention, and Qatar did not. So the signatories carry all the blame and all the burden. That is the whole asymmetry in one line. And he refuses to let Europe be painted as cold-hearted. Wait until he tells her where he watched the boats land.
But if you go to Italy now, and I don't know when you were last there, but it is not the case that this is going well in Italy, either for the migrants who are arriving or for the Italian population.
Isn't it because the resources are not being poured into this? Let's face it, the policies are not there, the resources aren't there.
I see these people when they arrive, I follow their stories. It is not the case just that they don't, you know, the local populations in Italy I've been to Lampedusa, I've seen the boats coming in. The local populations are extremely generous, they are extremely kind to the people. Most of the populations in Europe, let's just not have this idea that Europeans are somehow incredibly cold-hearted. Countries in Europe have taken in a lot of people, and they are trying to deal with a very big problem very swiftly.
Just putting the numbers in context, let me just mention this very briefly. 3 million people sought asylum in Europe between 2015 and 2016. That's a fraction of the population of Europe, which is 508 million.
And Germany and Sweden took in 3% of the population in 1 year alone. So we're not talking about negligible numbers, and you shouldn't pretend that we are.
He has stood on Lampedusa and watched the boats come in. She asks whether resources are the real problem. He says the Italian locals are extremely generous. That is not the answer a hostile room expects. 3 million asylum claims across a continent of 500 million. Numbers get thrown both directions here. Next comes a question about debt and 300 billion in aid.
Since you brought up migration from the developing world, I'd like to ask you this. Every year, the developed world sends about $300 billion of aid to the developing world, but the developing world sends back trillions in debt repayments to the developed world. Now, don't you think that this is the main reason why migrants are moving to Europe? Because money is moving out of the developing world. Wealth is leaving the developing world and moving to the developed world, to build on what Lamont Hill said. Don't you think this is why people are moving to the Western world, to the developed world?
Well, no, I don't. Again, I repeat the fact there are no simple answers. And if it was simply the fact that you could, I don't know, do a debt default or something and solve the whole migration issue, then that would be great. But it just isn't the case. You think that if for instance, all African countries were allowed to default on debt, that they'd become burgeoning, flourishing societies? You think that the problem across, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa isn't just unbelievable greed and theft by politician after politician? You think that if you just wrote off the debt, that would stop being an issue and everyone would become transparent and clean in their dealings with money? I mean, the problems are much deeper than this. They're much deeper than just a simple...
The question assumes debt is the engine of migration. Murray refuses the single cause answer flat. Write off African debt tomorrow. Do flourishing societies appear overnight? He names the actual obstacle. Theft by politician after politician. That is a sentence most panelists would never risk. He is not blaming people, he is blaming their rulers. And the Moynihan point is coming.
Solution like that, as if I may just add quickly to the previous two comments, the late very distinguished American diplomat Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a wonderful rule he came up with, known as Moynihan's Law, where he said that human rights, claims of human rights violations often happen in exactly inverse proportion to human rights violations. That is, you hear about them in the countries that are most free. And before long, you can end up with the presumption that the most free countries are the ones who are most abusive of human rights. And this happens with the case when we talk about our leaders and the ones... It's all very well. We can talk about the Trump administration, we can talk about the democracies and so on for all we like. We can all make criticisms, and we all should. But Okay,
Briefly.
Mr. Putin, what are you going to do about him? What are you going to do about the mullahs in Iran? What are you going to do about the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia? You see, what we end up with is this situation. We go, oh, Mr. Trump. We can all do that. Believe me, I can riff on Trump
again, you're being
all
quite
day.
selective, aren't you?
What are you going to do about the people you can't do anything about? Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to give them a pass? Or are you just going to enjoy beating up on the Democrats?
Moynihan's law lands like a hammer. Complaints about abuse rise where abuse is lowest. Free countries get audited. Closed ones get silence. Then he names them out loud. Putin, the mullahs in Iran, the House of Saud. He is standing in the Gulf while he says it. The moderator's entire rebuttal is one word: elections. The room applauds a word instead of an answer.
This is very briefly addressed to all of you. We have been talking about the role of developed countries, but how about our role? How about sustainable development? I mean, what comes after education? How do we develop those countries that we get out from after we get the education? Why don't we have goals set for what do I have to do to make my country developed? How do I make my country self-reliant? I mean, we've been talking about the role of developed countries. Why not talk about the role of developing countries? Thank you so much.
I think they are there's a dynamic relationship between those two things. And that's why I thought the previous question was important. While I agree with you, there's no silver bullet. There's no single answer to any of this. I think it would be hard to imagine any free African nation without imagining the role of structural adjustment policy, debt repayment in particular ways that it undermines its ability to self-sustain and to self-govern. So as I think about, in your question, the idea that we need to provide a self-sustaining Qatar or a self-sustaining Uganda, I mean, pick a place, right? Tanzania. We have to understand the role of the West in undermining that. Otherwise, we end up with a narrative like, why don't you people just clean yourselves up and pick yourself up by the bootstraps and self-govern? And I think it's a much more challenging and daunting task than that.
An audience member asks the question the panel avoided. What is the developing world's own role here? It is the sharpest question of the night. Mark Lamont Hill answers with structural adjustment policy, debt repayment, the West, and systemic constraint. Notice what never gets addressed. She asked about goals, self-reliance, and what comes after education. He answered about somebody else's responsibility.
So I'm going to talk briefly about, my mother's experience as an immigrant, and I want to touch here on something that Mark Lamont Hill said, this power of education and telling people how refugees fit into the wider context of economic development. Here's why I'm very skeptical about that. Because when my mother arrived in the UK and her parents arrived in the UK, people still called them dirty packies. When she had graduated from Oxford University, she was still a brown person who was not seen as a citizen, right? So to what extent can we really sell this idea that being educated or fitting X, Y, and Z criteria is what you need to do as a refugee for people to humanize you? The inherent problem with these people is that they don't humanize you. You can't fulfill your oppressor's criteria so that they see you as human. So how do you humanize people?
Dehumanizing refugees, thank you very much. And with this, let me go to you, Douglas Murray. Because much of your argument, Douglas, seems to be about the us versus them, the fact that, we have our own values, our own Britishness, our own virtues, and they will come to our shores with their values, their traditions. You seem to almost suggest that they come to your countries with a lesser breed of values.
That is a serious question, honestly asked. Her mother graduated from Oxford and still faced abuse. Nobody on this channel is dismissing that. But watch what the moderator does with it. She turns it into a phrase Murray never said. A lesser breed of values. Those are her words, put into his mouth. His answer is about to be the moment of the night.
No, I don't think I said that at any point, and that's another time you've tried to put something in my mouth.
So when you talk about the difference in values, what do you suggest?
Look, first of all, I didn't say that. I said that there are challenges because we do know that there are challenges, and let's just be frank about this. I mean, for instance, I've been in the Gulf for the last week or so. I see more burqas in my home city of London than I have seen in the Gulf in recent days, certainly here in Doha. Now, I can't say I'm delighted by the sight of more and more burqas in London. Do I feel any hatred of the people who wear them? Of course not. Of course not. But I can't say I'm elated by it. And definitely there are times I think, what percentage of burqas in this area becomes not that pleasant for everyone else?
But again, is it all down to burqas? Because again, you're not asking people with other traditions whether they care about the sight of people drinking alcohol or showing up in bikinis. Again, it's a very
we could in Britain
Western-centric viewpoint.
I'm not. I have to say, you're going to bark up the wrong tree if you think you're going to persuade a Brit that we should stop drinking alcohol because of people arriving in our country. I mean, that's not going to happen.
No, I don't think I said that. That is another time you've tried to put something in my mouth. The cleanest correction you will see on any stage. He says plainly he feels no hatred toward anyone. He is describing a change he sees in London. Her reply is British drinking culture. That is a real point. And he answers it directly. You will not persuade Britain to give up the pub.
These things are all a bit of give and take.
You bring your own traditions that don't quite fit with theirs.
Well,
they don't.
There are, as I said, and before we got all confrontational, which you did from the get-go, I said what the problem is here is that these things are all rubbing against each other. And in that situation, you have to work out what things you're willing to give up, which things you're willing to compromise on, and which ones you're not. You're not going to persuade the Brits to massively change their culture, but...
19 minutes, one hostile room, and not a single dodge. Every challenge got answered on the spot. Colonialism, answered with the Ottoman Empire. Arms sales, answered with Iran, Russia, and the Gulf. Debt relief, answered with corruption nobody wants named. And when the moderator invented a phrase for him, he handed it straight back. Murray's last word is the honest one. Cultures rub against each other, and someone has to decide what is negotiable. That conversation is not going away. Did Murray expose questions this panel could not answer, or was the moderator right to push him that hard? Drop your thoughts in the comments.